Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
So I'd like to move into kind of these three areas that you talk about within your model: self-regulation, attachment regulation, and sexual and erotic conflicts. Is that a good place to go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So why don't we just start there as far as, I don't know if you want to say something overall about the three of them, or if you just want to address each one individually, but we can start with self-regulation and how you want to talk about that.
Well, maybe let's just start just from this is how I think, Natasha.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of saying I think from the big picture. So for your listener who doesn't have this in front of them and can see this, let me just kind of visually give them a sense of what we're talking about here. Is that these vulnerability factors we've just spoken about and these clinical distinctions are sort of like the first step in a pathway. Picture walking down a path, and you don't go further down the path until you've really taken time to assess this portion of the path. These vulnerability factors and these clinical distinctions are the early part of the path. Once we've got a better sense of those, and any one of them is not so unstable that has to be addressed before we can go further down the path. Now we're ready to say, okay, we've assessed all these. Maybe they're now getting some treatment for some untreated depression. We don't have to worry about it's non-consensual. They're very motivated. They have a clear sense of what their conflicts are and what they're wanting to change about their lives. Their relationship with drugs and alcohol is not a significant factor here. There's not a medical condition that really could be an unseen issue. There's no issues of safety. Now we can go to the next stages of the path. And the next stages of the path are these three areas of human behavior, and I'm going to emphasize behavior. These are areas that we have lots of good research of understanding these components of human behavior. Now notice we're not moving into diagnosable pathology. We're moving into human behavior. And there's three areas of human behavior we focus on because we believe these areas of human behavior are the central areas of human behavior that when they're not well balanced can contribute to somebody not regulating their sexual behavior and being, most importantly, not able to stay within the 6 principles of sexual health. Because that's the outcome of our treatment. So picture the end of the path is their behavior is now completely congruent in a very high degree with these 6 principles of sexual health. That's the outcome of our behavior change we're working with men on. And the three areas that we think most make it difficult for a man to align his behavior with these principles of sexual health is men who are not very good at regulating themselves. They don't have good ability to regulate their behavior, and we'll go through that in a minute. Or their attachments with other people, the way they conduct themselves in relationships and the way they maintain attachments, the way they keep or not keep agreements within their relationships. We believe when that's not sufficiently balanced, they're not going to be able to align their lives with the 6 principles of sexual health. And lastly, the third area is sexual and erotic conflicts. So if there's something about how they understand themselves sexually, maybe their sexual orientation, if this isn't clear and sort of in a more balanced state, they're also not going to be able to have their behavior aligned with the 6 principles of sexual health. So that's our model. That's what Michael and I promote as the 3 primary areas of human behavior that we address so that their ultimate behavior at the end of the path is a life that's aligned with the 6 principles of sexual health and their personal vision of sexual health. So I wanted to say that before we got into why are we talking about these 3 things.
No, it's very useful, and I appreciate that. And I think it also is warranted to say that really, human behavior would include all kinds of behavior. We're happening to talk about sexual behavior at this point, and I think sometimes that can help people also understand that we don't necessarily pathologize, nail biting or There's a myriad of things that we do every day that we wish we didn't do, right? Or that we have
we,
trouble
we don't we don't
regulating.
pathologize not putting on a seatbelt.
Right, right. But that most of us are engaged in some type of behavior modification throughout our lives, right? Most of us want to improve in some area of our life or move towards healthier habits in whatever area that might be. And so I just want to throw that out there as a way to, again, go back to this idea that we're not talking about pathology, but that most of us want to improve. And if people want to improve their sexual health and regulation of their sexual behavior, those can be really great goals.
Yeah, and that's why in our definition of out-of-control sexual behavior, we start by saying this is a sexual health problem. And we're trying to communicate that this is a human behavior problem like anything else, that we don't want people to get distracted because the content of that behavioral problem is sexual. Marty Klein talks about how sex is this universal area of cultural conflict, and so that can distract both the clinician and the client to overly focus on the fact that this issue is sexual. So we're trying to find a way to conceptualize this issue within the breadth of human behavior and all of its problems, and utilize all the resources and research that have helped us understand how behavior can become problematic for people.
Right, and so the research we use first then, Michael, if we just want to move to that, is we talk a lot about regulation. We have integrated into our model a lot of the research and understanding of how humans actually regulate themselves. What are some of the primary theories and understandings of how people regulate behavior and regulate impulses?
You can hear in how we work. We like to define terms so we all kind of know what we're talking about. So when we're talking about self-regulation, that's defined by how people may alter or change how they feel, or prolong and amplify a feeling, or even just aligning their behavior within their own standards and values. So, that can be anything. So typically people are talking about changing or altering how they feel using behavior that is usually kind of negative, uncomfortable affects, or prolonging and amplifying. Those are the pleasurable things. So sex can be one quick and easy way that someone can use to change a feeling of, say, loneliness or sadness, worry and anxiety by using a behavior that is pleasurable, and that's sex. So we want to get an understanding of how people do that, because sometimes people may be more adept at it than others. So we want to understand their particular capacities around self-regulation on a whole, but then more specifically with sex. We also like to understand, all right, is this person someone who experiences a high sex drive? So here they are then now having to regulate this constant or kind of more frequent pinging of their sexual attention and drive that requires more energy to restrict, more, let's say, willpower. So we're trying to understand in their clinical pictures, all right, am I dealing with someone who has high excitation, a high capacity for a sex drive, and just they're not balancing that with a degree of inhibition? It's all right, great. We know that about you. Maybe we need to bolster some of that inhibiting capacity.
I'll maybe draw a distinction here.
Sure.
This high desire difference, where men who have very high desire, or from another model of sexual response, are high exciters. When they're in a sexual situation, the level of excitation they feel can be very high, whereas other men in their most heightened sexual situation, the level of excitation they feel might be very moderate. Or for some men, the most excited they get is actually fairly low levels of excitation. And we now know through science, sexual science, that men vary in this capacity person to person. So we believe some of the men who are having these regulation dilemmas are high exciters, or I have high levels of desire, and we don't really teach men how to handle that well. We don't even tell them or educate them that that's kind of who they are. And so when they have these high levels of desire or excitation, they may not handle it very well. And that doesn't necessarily mean pathology. That just may mean they just haven't been really given the kind of guidance and mentoring and help on how to live in our society and within other value systems, if this happens to be who you are. And this is being supported in somewhat by some recent research that is showing that men, this is men again populations, where they're showing men who have been identified or reach clinical thresholds in sex addiction measures or compulsive sexual addiction measures tend to be men who are also high desire and high exciters. And it's possible that we're confusing men who have high excitation levels who just haven't been well, mentored on how to function as a person with high excitation, and that's getting called an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In other words, that there's something broken about you, whereas this might be just part of the spectrum of normal human range in libido, and then it's a management issue, is your point.
Mm-hmm. Right, and not only a management, but an education issue. I mean, where do men go if they're a high sexual exciter to learn how to live responsibly as a high sexual exciter?
Right.
I mean, if you have a race car that you at the Indy 500, and you have a 1930 stick shift Chrysler, you have to know how to operate each of those vehicles so that you can find pleasure in them.
I think we kind of separate kind of two things that we were talking about. It's like, one, are they using sex as a way to change how they're feeling, kind of regulating their own affect so that the sexual behavior has a particular function for them? Or two, are they kind of unprepared to, kind of, as Doug's metaphor, to drive this vehicle, their body that has this high capacity for sexual excitation? So part of the therapy can be helping them identify that, integrate that into how they understand themselves, and to help them make different choices sexually that aligns with the sexual principles and their own personal sexual vision.
And I think it's really important at this point, too, to say that regulating mood, and I think you address this, like sadness or stress or anxiety through sexual release, is actually normal, that's an actually can be a very positive coping skill. And that's one of my concerns with some of the assessments around sex addiction, is that that's posited as a question, like, well, if you're using sex to self-medicate, that's not necessarily a good thing. And I think that's actually a very healthy coping mechanism, as long as it's done in these parameters that you're talking about, consensually, under sexual health principles, etc.
But this is the territory we have to be very cautious in, because this is where values differences really come into the conversation. Somebody could agree with what you just said, Natasha, and they might be in a relationship with somebody who feels absolutely differently about that exact idea. In fact, they might be repelled at the idea that you're using orgasm to regulate your low mood. And it may be your spouse. It might be your church. It might be your therapist. We're now in the territory where values differences, if somebody's not aware enough that that's my bias, that's my opinion, and they may have a real significant values difference here with somebody they're in a relationship with. If that's not clearly understood, then it moves into the territory of, well, that's an okay thing to do. Like we as professionals, because we're educated, say, well, I approve of that. Of course, that's reasonable. But the person, their entire culture and world may be an environment that says, no, that is not an acceptable motivation for sex. It is wrong, it is immoral, or it's not mentally healthy to use orgasm to regulate moods. And these are some of our clients' worlds that they're trying to figure out how to navigate when this is the messages they're getting from their attachments.
So do we want to move into attachment regulation?
Right, because I think that's what happens with attachment regulation is when these conflicts come up, oftentimes, a way to resolve these conflicts is the attachment is called into question. If you don't move to my position of what is an acceptable motivation for sex, if you don't move into my perception of how I think sex is morally good, or if you don't move into my perspective of how sex is acceptable to me or is the kind of sex I want you to have, if you don't do that, I may just sever this relationship. These are the kinds of binds some people find themselves in around attachment regulation. And too often the way men that we treat solve this painful conflict is they become secretive. The solution to this conflict is hide the conflict, avoid it, don't face it. And then they create a secretive life. They do all these sorts of things to justify it, because underneath that is the terror of losing an important attachment if I were to be honest. That's the sexual health principle. If I were to be honest about this conflict and to try to face it. And we have to be, I think, empathic here. Where do couples, where do adults learn the skills to engage in these very painful and difficult discussions?
And I think what's been embedded in our conversation that we haven't really talked about explicitly is that we are constantly listening for a client's competing motivations. We find that the sexual behavior is typically the result of how they've navigated that internally. So they may have this motivation to be sexual, but then they have this motivation that's based on their values around sex. So they're trying to navigate that tension so that can have the internal competing motivations, but also in the attachment clinical area, now we're talking about external competing motivations. That I have this sexual interest, my spouse has this sexual value. I want to maintain this relationship, but I also want to maintain my sexuality. That's a bind that they're in, and they've come now, in my view, to therapy to resolve that in a way that is satisfying. So we're constantly listening to see how they have these internal competing motivations, but also these external competing motivations.
I've had clients who have an interest, let's say, they like oral sex, and the partner is disgusted or doesn't enjoy oral sex. It's a conflict they've never resolved. And so what a man will do is begin to resolve that conflict by going elsewhere. Am I saying that's a good treatment plan? No. But this is what people will do. Mm-hmm. And then this treatment plan gets discovered. And it can be prematurely labeled as a pathology or a disordered state or an addiction without carefully looking at all of the factors that may have led this man to choose not a very good treatment plan for a very difficult dilemma.
Yeah, this secrecy piece is very much a very common theme that I see in my work. So, because it's not just the relationship, it's the entire culture has set it up this way. There's really only one way to be sexually worthy, and that's within a marital context. And even in that marital context, it's quite rigid. So no pornography, no outside fantasies or desires, really. You're supposed to be kind of focused on this one person that is your spouse, and that's where your sexual energy and thoughts and actions happen with.
So how does the culture help people who can't comply with that?
It disciplines them.
In what way?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't help them. so in other words, right. So there's a confession. There's a that's unfortunate that you're doing that. Let's put you through some type of repentance process where you can rely on God and focus on your spiritual tools like prayer and fasting and get more involved with your spirituality so that somehow these things will just kind of go away and you won't betray your spouse anymore. And and sometimes that involves pretty serious disciplinary issues such as disfellowshipment, losing your callings, even excommunication, with the idea that you would work towards getting rebaptized. So this is all very much through that kind of punitive lens and behavioral correction.
Are there people that are helped by this? I mean, that's a process. Are some people actually helped by that process, and they actually feel supported by it?
I think oftentimes the spouse feels very supported and vindicated because there's a system saying you have a right to be hurt. And oftentimes there is a right to be hurt because there is secrecy and there is betrayal and there is a contract that has been broken. They're not negotiating their sexuality together. So of course there's betrayal. So that can feel very hopeful for the spouse. I think even for the person going through it, oftentimes when they're in that context, yes, it feels helpful. It's like I'm being punished correctly. I deserve this. I deserve this. And maybe I can course correct through some of these ways. And some people, I think, actually do stop certain behaviors because of the fear of divorce or the fear of further church discipline. And so they get kind of back on track with the expectations that the culture has of them sometimes.
And for the people who don't have who don't feel helped or don't feel supported by that response, where are they left? What do they have?
Well, in my experience, it's back to a secrecy cycle.
Okay, so then if that option doesn't feel like a helpful, hopeful, process or path, then again, the treatment plan for most people is to go back to the treatment plan of secrecy as the solution.
Or leave the church, which then causes a whole nother kind of dilemma for the marriage if they're married, or for themselves. I mean, that's the faith transition has its own, oftentimes positive things, but also very negative things associated with that. So
let me translate both of those options from our model then. Leave the church is the attachment component of our model. So basically what you're saying is, for some people, they choose, or they have to face the loss of the attachment with their religion, their community, their God. They have to face possibly that loss of that attachment. And then the secrecy is, of course, the other option is to not comply with one of the fundamentals of sexual health, which is honesty. So either I have to face this attachment dimension, or I have to face not aligning my life with one of the 6 principles of sexual health. And those are the choices that other people are left with.
Yeah, and then I'll complicate it even a little further. I mean, I think some of the people that do what I think is really good work with me is where they'll kind of take back some of their own authority and say, we're going to decide what is sexually healthy for us, and not let necessarily the church decide that for us. But the honesty piece still comes into it, because when the church asks questions for members about their sexuality in order to see if they're worthy enough, for example, to hold the temple recommend. And so then there's this sense of, well, I'm going to nuance that answer. We've decided as a couple how we're going to answer that. But there's still a level of, I think, difficulty in them feeling like they're being dishonest with their ecclesiastical leaders. Like, for instance, if they've decided pornography is going to be a part of their marital contract, or even a segment of non-monogamy, or anything along those lines, they know that the church would not approve of that, but they approve of it as a couple, and so they kind of nuance it, but they're still dealing with that conflict of dishonesty at some level.
Right. So again, this trade-off between the attachment dimension and the honesty dimension of the sexual health principles seem to be common narratives that people are trying to navigate in these binds.
Yes.
And that this is a common clinical experience, possibly in your community or the cultures in which you work with a lot of your clients. These are common sexual health or competing motivations. This is the language we would use in our model to describe what you've just kind of laid out for us in a more cultural context within, it sounds like, the Mormon faith. Mm-hmm. This is how we would discuss it without it having to be, languaged within the Mormon narrative, but more from the OCSB narrative.
Mm-hmm. Which gets us into the sexual and erotic conflicts, I think, as well, right? Piece of your model.
Well, yeah, I think with sexual imagery in particular, one of the things we find with sexual imagery is that oftentimes erotic interests that are not accessible within the partnered or coupled relationship, oftentimes a person can experience through fantasy by looking at imagery and masturbation. So they'll watch scenes of people doing things sexually that they would like to do, but are forbidden or would be disapproved of or could threaten their attachments. And they resolve that conflict by pursuing these activities in their private masturbatory life. And oftentimes the exact imagery they're looking at is a source of significant conflict, and they either not honest about this, or it becomes another form of secrecy, or perhaps even the fact that they're masturbating to imagery. Just the fact that they're doing that for some people is secretive.
Absolutely. Right, because there is no, I guess that's where I feel like people in my faith are really kind of stuck in a catch-22, other than if you just don't have these types of desires to begin with. But if you do have the desires, and if you want to even fall into kind of the fantasy level of it, none of that is approved of as far as the church. Masturbation isn't approved of in the church. Mm-hmm. So much less looking at imagery.
So I'd like to challenge this word catch-22, because we deal with this with our clients a lot. And I think that's a perspective that is not as helpful for clients. It's not a catch-22. They're making choices between their attachments. They're prioritizing which problem they're going to attend to. And sometimes the solution requires a compromise of values or ethics in order to maintain a higher need. I think that's human life. And so I like to point out to our clients, you're not powerless here. You are making a choice. You're saying, I'm going to be less honest with my church elders, so I don't have to face the disapproval and perhaps, punishing responses in that relationship. I'm going to choose to be less honest there, so I can have this erotic pleasure. I'm making that choice. And here's my solution to that dilemma.
And it would take it even further in the sense that we were talking about a definition of out of control sexual behavior is when someone feels out of control. And that honesty principle, I always like to talk about how that's first honesty with myself, honesty with what my vision of sexual health is, with what I'm aroused by, what interests me, and then moving to a degree of honesty with my attachment objects. That be my spouse, that be girlfriends, boyfriends, or in here we're talking about religious institutions. So we're kind of moving it away from this subconscious, automatic, not mentalized state where they're feeling out of control to a more conscious, verbal choice that they're making as a way to manage the binds that they find themselves in, whether that be creating distance in their church or, as Doug was talking about, compromising their own ethic around honesty, as you said, kind of changing or equivocating some of their answers to maintain their position in the church or within the church community.
Do you have examples yourselves of working with Mormon clients that you'd like to talk about, maybe as we've maybe laid out the model?
Yes, I had now this is some time ago, so Natasha, I'm going to have you may have to help me with if things have changed in the cultural context or the religious context since this time.
Okay.
But this is the late, I'm going to say this is about 99, 2000, somewhere around there. I had a man come and see me who was, very involved in his Mormon faith, and it was actually moving up within the hierarchy. And again, I'm not Mormon, so I don't know these cultural references, but he was definitely moving up in the hierarchy, where it came a conflict with him. He was in his early 30s. It became a conflict for him how he was conducting his sexual life as he moved up into these levels of authority and influence in his Mormon community. And so he went to his bishop and said, I am having sex with men anonymously in places where men have anonymous sex. This was before the internet. But I'm not having sex with women because I know I should not have sex with a woman until I'm married. He was not a married man. So he brought this to his bishop as his conflict. He was honest with his bishop about it, right? Sexual health principle. He was honest. Went to his bishop for help with this conflict. And the bishop said to him, you need to go and get assessed by a sex addiction therapist, and you need a diagnosis of sex addiction. Because if your sexual activity with men is determined to be a disorder, a sex addiction, you can remain in good standing in the Mormon Church. If that sexual behavior is determined as you are actually possibly a gay man, or you're bisexual, or you actually have attractions, or this is something you desire to be sexual with men, and you continue to act on it, and it's not a sex addiction, then you can't be a Mormon.
Okay.
And so he came. So that was the situation then. He came to me. I did an assessment with him, and he did not have out of control sexual behavior. What he had was a conflict. He had desires and attractions and actually love dreams about men. He didn't have the same kinds of attractions for women. This was a terribly painful dilemma for him. And I couldn't give him, in an ethical way, a diagnosis of a disorder because he didn't have it. And so he left the therapy or the assessment with me and went to sexual reorientation therapy that was provided through the Mormon Church at that time. That was the outcome of the case.
Okay, so let me breathe through that on several levels, I guess. It's interesting as you, especially a non-Mormon therapist, there's a lot of issues there as far as what would be considered one bishop's positions or ideas or how he interprets things versus policy, direct policy of the church. So I'm not sure that there's anything directly relating to if you have a sex addiction, then you can stay in versus you don't have a sex addiction, that's going to be treated differently in disciplinary courts. That's part of the problem, is that it's, as highly correlated as we are not necessarily very correlated when it comes to discipline results. So I have seen a variety of ways that goes down depending on who the bishop is in any particular region.
So I shouldn't draw any conclusions from this case other than it was this man in the community I happened to be living in. I should not make any generalizations that would be a consistent experience in different settings.
Agreed. Except for now, as far as the homosexuality piece, I would agree with more. That has always been more apt to be disciplined, more apt to be treated with concern, and even, things like you have, I guess, some type of monitoring system where homosexual members would not be allowed to work in positions with children. In other words, that idea that there could potentially be some type of pedophile correlation. I mean, that's unfortunately very endemic in our church history. So there's definitely been an ongoing problem with disciplining members for homosexual activity, and that was put into policy last year. So that is now an official policy that if you are in a same-sex marriage in particular, you will face discipline in our church. And and if you are acting sexually, you will more than likely face discipline in our church. The only area where we have made some progress that I was actually very hopeful back in the early 2000s, that we did move away from orientation being a choice, that there was a sense that this is something you can't necessarily just go to reparative therapies about and have it change. So we have made that step in the right direction as a church. But then the expectation now is celibacy.
I read a blog story about that recently, so that's congruent with what I read. It was a man telling his story and his journey, and he came to the decision to be celibate as a Mormon, as a gay man. That was the outcome of his story. So, okay.
Yeah, so if again, using your model, he's going to make choices, and he's going to choose his membership and his honesty with the church, then it leaves very little room, if any room, to be honest with himself about his sexuality or his sexual needs. Which gets me to, I guess, a conversation I'd like to have for a few minutes, if possible, as far as the ethics of mental health professionals and how this model helps you look at that. So, for example, and this comes from, I believe it was Jay Gay who told me this or made me think about it in this way, or Ricky Siegel, one of the two. Anyway, they said, if you're a mental health practitioner and somebody comes in and says, yeah, I've been diagnosed with anorexia by my previous clinician, and you go through the assessment and you realize that is an accurate diagnosis, and the client comes in with the goal of losing another 7 pounds, because that's what they want to work on. There's, ethical consideration as a mental health clinician to look at that goal as not in congruence with the health of the client. And I think that this is an issue that we as clinicians really struggle with, especially with sexuality. So, for example, it's very hard for me if somebody comes in and says, my goal is to stop masturbating altogether, and they're 16 years old and they're a virgin, and it's the only ability for them to have any type of sexual release, and I'm just not going to be a sexual being at all in my thoughts or in my fantasies or in my touching myself until I'm married. That's my goal, because in a sense, that's what the church is asking their goal to be. And I know that there's something unhealthy about that goal. So I'm just wondering, again, with all of these, the example we just gave about homosexual members expected to just live celibate lives, not be in relationship with another person, not even be romantic with another person, right? So it's not just even about sexual acts. So the expectations of a certain culture can really go against what we know are mental health and sexual health and physical health standards of our research and our knowledge as clinicians. So, yeah, what do you have to say about all that?
Yeah, the first word that comes to my mind is when the clinician observes somebody and comes to the opinion that something is unhealthy for the client. that I like to back myself up from that word and become more client-centered. Rather than my opinion of unhealth, I would want to back up and talk with this boy. How did you come to this treatment plan? How did you decide that given all of the factors involved in this situation, this was the treatment plan you wanted to follow? And so I would spend a lot of time before getting into anything about what's healthy or unhealthy about a particular client's behavior. I would want to spend a lot of time talking with that client about how they came up with this treatment plan. And helping them describe all the details very honestly with themselves. I did this because I don't want to lose my relationship with God, or I am doing this so that I can have the kind of, and so the client gets to hear them speak aloud these dilemmas that maybe very privately, without ever kind of saying it out loud, they came to these decisions. And so I think the mental health professional, the ethical, I'm not going to make it to the standard of ethics. I'm going to make it as maybe a clinical option rather than ethical standard, is that you'd want to slow down and have the client educate you how they came to this solution before you help them implement the solution.
Yeah, my mind was going back to kind of what we talk about regarding our approach to protect clients' sexual autonomy. So we have kind of embedded in our approach this concept of freedom from, freedom to, and clients are free to sexually express themselves, as well as to be free from sexual discrimination, oppression, things like that. So it's a way to help us remember that, kind of what our job is here. Once kind of their behaviors within those sexual health principles, what we like to say is that their sexual behavior is up to them. So I like Doug's approach in talking about getting curious about that boundary and that choice. I may also, as a professional, want to make certain that they are informed in that choice, in the sense of letting them know about what are the potential outcomes of that type of restriction. So that could have some negative consequences, that they may set up a boundary that they aren't able to follow through on consistently, and that's going to have some psychological consequences. And they may also not benefit from some of the other, positive outcomes of sexual expression, of pleasure, of the vitality that can be attached to sexual behavior. But I also want to be mindful when we set up conversations around metaphor. So the metaphor was, this person's anorexic, and then they're going to ask to lose 7 pounds. I appreciate the concern regarding that negative outcome, but anorexia is anorexia. Here we're talking about sexual behavior. The consequences are different. So I want to make certain that the client is fully informed of the sexual consequences and not be restricted as a clinician because the metaphor is kind of within that anorexia example.
Yeah, and I think that's where my moral concern, or my own ethical, is I try to very much look at my own biases and look at all of the different ideas that I have. But it really comes down to this, even though, anorexia is probably not the perfect metaphor, what is my role in sitting with somebody who has a goal that I truly do believe will not lead to good mental health, and that's supported. That's supported by research, right? That's supported. It's not. I don't feel like I'm making some huge leap of inappropriate moral self-biased statement, right? It's like I've seen the results of it. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in my clients' lives. It's over and over and over again. And so it's difficult to know what my role is then. I don't want to just say, well, I'll just respect your values and we'll work towards things that I think will harm you. I also don't want to play a role in changing people's values, which is, I think, what you're getting at with your first comment, helping people understand why they're coming at their values the way they are anyway. But thirdly, I do see my role as somewhat of a psychoeducator. I think we all play that role at some level. and understanding risks and consequences and ways that...
So one way I would think about this situation, Natasha, is our model is also, heavily embedded in the stages of readiness for change.
Mm-hmm.
Interview model. So what you seem to be describing is what in the MI model, motivational interviewing model, is what's called a stage discrepancy between therapist and client. The client may be at a pre-contemplative stage of change around this aspect of their sexual behavior, and you're not at a pre-contemplative stage of change. You're ready to have that client take action. You're even kind of mortified at the idea that the client is not even contemplating any other course of action than this one. And so sometimes as therapists, we're asked to sit in a stage discrepant moment with a client who's a pre-contemplator and work with them in pre-contemplative stages of readiness interventions, even though we have strong research, strong moral principles, strong ethical, clinical information that we know is completely supported. And yet the client is at a pre-contemplative stage of change. Our responsibility, I believe, is to work with the client at their stage of readiness in ways that move them to the next stage of readiness for change, which is to just contemplate a change, not make a change, just contemplate it. So this situation you're describing seems to be you're sitting with a pre-contemplator. And how do you work with pre-contemplators in ways that you feel good about, you can feel ethically sound with, and clinically responsible, but you still got a pre-contemplator in front of you?
Clinically, we want to preserve the therapeutic alliance, so we want to avoid things that are going to create discord. So we want to make certain that we are aware of our own countertransference around sitting with someone who might be engaging in a particular sexual behavior or restricting sexual expression in a way that we fear is going to have some significant consequences. So we can help motivate them towards sexual health, but also to make certain that we are working with their internal conflict and not making it about a conflict between me and my client. Because we can kind of enhance their self-discrepancy. That's what's going to motivate them toward change, but not when the conflict moves out of that being a self-discrepant moment to a conflict between me and my client.
Sure.
But these are hard moments for therapists. Yeah. It's hard to sit in these moments and actually watch clients do things that all of our education tells us is delusional, harmful, will not eventually get them to where they want to go. And I think our clients ask us to do this all the time. I mean, how often have you sat with a bipolar client who wants no part of taking medications? And yet we know medications is the only treatment course that really offers hope to somebody with a biologically determined bipolar disorder. But that doesn't mean they don't ask us to sit in our offices and go through these, mood swings uncontrollably until they finally get to the point where they realize I have a disease that can only be managed by medications. And they may come to that through the school of hard knocks. And sometimes they ask us to watch them do it.
Right. This has been excellent. I'm so grateful for your time here and for laying out so many of these wonderful ideas and such a useful model. Seriously, I've been reading your book and going to your conferences. So can I have you both just kind of give some closing thoughts? Is there anything I didn't mention that you want to make sure you mention, and let you get on your way? Because I know we're way over time.
I think the thing I'd want to say, Natasha, is that the sexual health model for working with out-of-control sexual behavior is an alternative way of working with this behavior that has found to be helpful for some of the clients we work with. Now, does that mean this is the model? This is sort of the way to work with this behavior? No, we don't really know very much about this human behavior. And we just felt like it was important to have an alternative model to the sex addiction treatment model so that the consumer would have choices to move towards a model of care they felt more hope for. Not everybody feels hope in the sex addiction model. nor is it necessarily helpful for everybody who has these concerns. So here's just an alternative model that we have found when men find us and come to us and learn about this, and other therapists learn about this model. They're finding there is a cohort of patients and clients out there who resonate well with moving towards a vision of sexual health rather than ameliorating an addictive process.
Thank you.
And I would add, you can find Doug at theharveyinstitute.com, and you can find me at icounselingservices.com. And we love having these sexual health conversations with people, and we look forward to having more of them soon.
And I got to tell you, you asked great questions.
Oh, good.
I've done several of these interviews, Michael and I recently. It was so nice to talk with you and have you be informed and have your own perspectives that we could have really good dialogue. Natasha, it's so rich to have these kinds of interactions. I got to tell you.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. I
You
really appreciate it.
You're a good thinker. You're a really good thinker. So I'm imagining the clients sitting in your office really get a lot of good help. I just can't imagine them not.
Oh, thank you. I hope so.
And I also want to add is thank you for being this bridge into this culture and community. I mean, we need sexual health allies to be able to do that, because Doug and I don't have the same cultural understanding as you do.
Right. No,
so thank you for functioning as that bridge.
It's amazing to have people like you be willing to do stuff like this. It's just really a wonderful thing. So I very much appreciate it. Thank you again so much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go. All wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.